Good morning and welcome to Cross2Cross Conversations. And this is Monica. I'm doing a series today. Not a series. It was originally going to be a series leading up to Juneteenth, but then I decided that I wanted to do this in one sitting. So it's going to be quite long. And if you're not one to sit through a long movie or have problems just sitting through anything for an extended period of time, then go ahead and take breaks and watch it in sections or in chunks. But please make sure you come back for the conversation. This is a conversation regarding Juneteenth. And as I sit here, I was like, do I start with Happy Juneteenth? I don't know. I don't normally do certain videos or specific videos around any particular holiday, but this one stood out for me this year. And over the past couple of weeks, I have been thinking about whether or not I was going to even do this, even though I have planned this one for at least a month and a half now. But this past couple of weeks, with certain things that have been going on in the news and things that I've been reading, and, I was like, do I really want to do this? Because sometimes some conversations, some things you read become quite exhausting after a while. If I'm being totally honest, it becomes exhausting because no matter what you say, will things change? But see, that was the point of cross-to-cross conversations to begin with. It, my tagline says, where silence meets voice. And this is different for me anyways, if you've known me for any length of time, because I don't get into certain conversations simply because sometimes people don't always respect where you stand on an issue and relationships are lost. There are sometimes things said that you can't necessarily take back and, disrespect happens. And therefore, it's not that I am afraid to speak about certain things. I only have the conversations with a limited number of people. But today is different. Today, I decided to have this video, this podcast, whatever you want to call it, both, regarding Juneteenth. And notice I put free indeed with a question mark. So let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, this video may be quite long, so I'm asking your forgiveness up front. Some of you may be asking, why, Monica, are you using red, white, and blue? That color doesn't represent us. Well, I used it because as I was doing my research, I didn't even realize that Juneteenth had its own flag, and I wanted to represent the history of Juneteenth. The red, white, and blue is supposed to represent the freedom for America, and it is supposed to even represent freedom for America, for all people, for all Americans, for all people who are part of this United States of America. But more where I want to go with this is that I want to speak about the enslaved people. That is what Juneteenth was about. And from what I was reading, that the design of this Juneteenth flag, it was representing something. It was supposed to represent that there's something new on the horizon. There was a new freedom, a new people, and therefore there was a new star. And the red, white, and blue colors was supposed to communicate that the American slaves and their descendants were all Americans. That's what I read, that the lady who thought about this design, that's the message she wanted to send. And there are different meanings across this flag that I was able to find. So the arc that you see there, that's pointing right there, that's supposed to represent a new horizon, meaning fresh opportunities and promises for Black Americans. And then the star itself, the star, from what I was able to see, was because Juneteenth, and we're going to get into more of what is Juneteenth, but I already know I will lose some people right at the red, white, and blue. Unfortunately, that's where we are today. So I wanted to explain what this star is because my background slides, the background has this particular flag. So, but the star, let me stay focused. The star here is supposed to represent the Lone Star State because remember, that's where the slaves were. They were in Texas when they got word that slavery was over. But it's also supposed to stand for the freedom of every Black America in all, every Black American in all 50 states. And then this burst here, the burst that you see around the star, that is supposed to represent a new beginning for everyone. So there is a purpose for the flag that I had no idea about. And that's why I do like when I study things. I love to study. I love to research. I just love to do those things because I am like a sponge and I like to learn new things. But let's just keep it going here because when I bring up Juneteenth or when I see a lot of people posting about Juneteenth, they tend to use the Pan-African flag a lot. And so I looked that up because a lot of people use this as the flag for Juneteenth. And again, this also have meaning. The red, the red, black, and green each represented something. So the red was supposed to be um, from my study was that it represented the blood of the people of from Black African ancestry that was shed for their liberation. And I know some of you was like, Monica, only, there's only one blood that was shed. And I know, don't go there. Don't do that. I'm just letting you know what when I looked up what these colors meant, this is what it said to me. This is what it said. And then the black is supposed to be for the people whose existence as a nation, thought not a nation state, is affirmed by the existence of the flag. And forgive my typo there. And by the way, I like to give credit where credit is due. So let me let you know I took this from a website, um, NJ, can't remember. Definitely, I'll put it in the show notes when I find it though. And then finally, what did the green mean? The green meant the abundant and vibrant natural wealth of Africa. So that is what I see a lot of people use when they're saying Juneteenth. And while it does speak about liberation and it does speak about unification, can I be honest? I'm not from Africa. I am a Black American. I am a Black American. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with my Black brothers and sisters, but I wanted to make sure I'm using the flag that represents Juneteenth in America because there's a reason for this. And let's go ahead and get started because there is a purpose for this. I'm not here just simply to speak about Juneteenth in itself, but how many of you were with me when I did the Black History Month series a few months ago in February, and I did 7 series about Black History Month, about slavery. And then I did the last episode. The 7th episode was on the movie Leave the World Behind, and I called it Leave the World Behind Exposed. And I have to bring this up again because before I get into the history a little bit about June 10th, I need to be honest with you about something. So I missed something here, and it was something that was so glaring. But sometimes, when you study like I do, you get into the weeds and you miss the forest for the trees, right? And I missed it. So when I did the whole series, sorry, I did the whole series on Leave the World Behind, and I was tracking numbers, I was tracking, you know, the numbers within the movies because it all represented something. And those numbers, 16, 17, 18, 19, 76, 96. There was so much going on there. And I was so focused on Mississippi being the last one to ratify the 13th Amendment, that I walked right past Texas. How can I do that? I walked right past Texas. Um, and I wanted to kind of bring us back to the Leave the World Behind episode again, movie again, just so you can kind of put it all together. And maybe you didn't watch my Juneteenth, my Black History Month series. Please go back and watch that. I thought it was a great series. It actually opened my eyes to a lot of things. My whole goal was to bring out what I thought about the movie Leave the World Behind, but I had to prepare you for it. I had to prepare your mind to accept what I was presenting about the movie. And why did I say it was being exposed? What was that about? I had shared before I did the series about it, before I did the videos about it, there were people who was like, "Oh, Monica, you're digging, you're looking into it too much." So leave the world behind. What are you talking about, Monica, now? What are you talking about? I told you that leave the world behind. Why was it being exposed? Because the movie is about slavery and America's reckoning with slavery. And I know some of you probably were turning me off already, but that's okay. That's okay. But if you're one to like to hear the truth, then go ahead and continue to listen. I'm going to bring out part of the um I'm going to bring out part of the movie that leads up to the Juneteenth call out. But if you go back and watch the series from Black History Month, so back in last February, then you will see the greater picture. But here I'm only going to go over some things. So in the movie, as they're heading to this vacation home to this beach house, they're driving down the highway, and one of the things that you see is Fort Mose Road and Point Comfort. You see signs pointing to that, and Point Comfort has exit 76. So, really quick, what is Fort Mose Road? Well, Fort Mose was the first legally sanctioned free black settlement in what would become the United States. It was a Spanish colony. Sorry, slow down, Monica. It was a Spanish colonial sanctuary in Florida. And from what I read, it was established in 1738, but this was where enslaved people who escaped from the British colonies, they could go there to Fort Mose to claim their freedom. So Fort Mose was what freedom could have looked like. So that was Fort Mose. But then the other sign there, the other highway sign is Point Comfort, exit 76. So, what is Point Comfort? And this is all taken from the movie Leave the World Behind. So, Point Comfort is actually in Virginia, even though the movie takes place in New York. Again, look at the signs. Point Comfort is actually in Virginia. And what's important about that? Because in 1619, that is the exact location where the ship called the White Lion arrived in August of that year. So in August of 1619, the ship White Lion arrived carrying the first enslaved Africans um, to Virginia. It was the beginning, or what people believe was the beginning of American slavery. So you have Fort Mose, where slavery before America was born, I guess you want to say. But before America, people would go to Fort Mose, enslaved people, to gain their freedom. But then you have the other highway sign talking about Point Comfort, and that was where slavery began. And then what's important about that number 76? If some of you watched this the other video, then you already know. But 76, as in 1776, the Declaration of Independence. And that was where all men were created equal. But the ironic part about that, if you even want to say it's ironic, it was written by a man who had enslaved over 600 people himself. So just even between these two signs, if you look at it, you can have what people would say is the entire story of Black America: freedom and bondage. Freedom and bondage, promise and betrayal. So, what could have been chosen and what was chosen instead between those two? You basically, this is what the signs were pointing towards. And in the movie, if you've watched the movie Leave the World Behind, you see they take the exit leading to Point Comfort. Again, Point Comfort is actually in Virginia, but this is taking place in New York. The movie is. So then the next thing I want to show you is the family. They decide to go to the beach, and while they're in the beach, they see this big ship coming towards the beach, and it's not stopping. And at first, it's way out there, and it was the daughter who noticed it. But then after a while, everyone's asleep, everyone's relaxing, they're doing their thing on the beach, and guess what? The white lion is approaching, and it's not stopping. Well, the ship is approaching, and you don't find out what's on this ship until you see the name White Lion. And I just told you what White Lion represented. It was the first slave ship to America in 1619. It brought the first enslaved Africans to Point Comfort. And you see here, the ship is beaching itself. At least that's what I said in my last video about this. It's beaching itself, meaning America's sins are coming to shore. And what's one of the greatest sins that people say America has committed? It was the sin of slavery. And so, what I said in my video was that past trauma was physically manifesting itself in present day, and that there's no escaping, and that history was finally washing ashore, and there was a reckoning that has arrived. So, again, if you didn't watch the movie Leave the World Behind, I had someone tell me, stop telling people to watch that demonic movie. Listen, watch it at your own risk. There is a little bit of cursing in there, not much. There is some sexual implications, just a little bit. And honestly, if you're just anyways, watch at your own risk. It's maybe about 5 minutes of the entire movie. It's not any kind of explicit sex scenes or anything like that. Again, the movie is about America. A reckoning has happened, and that America's sins are coming to shore. And what do people say was the biggest sin ever? And that is the sin of slavery. And so this movie is actually about slavery. So let me again, so now I also spoke with you about how I broke down that last part of the movie about truly that is about slavery. This is what we have here. We have two families here. We have the Sanfords and we have the Scotts. Now, this movie was based on a book um, called Leave the World Behind. In the book, the Black family's last name was Washington, which is funny in itself, right? And the other family name, the white family's name, is Sanford. And the Black family arrived to the house. They said there was a blackout in New York, and this is their house, and this is the only place they knew to come. And they just appeared at the door. Of course, technology is messing up. Of course, in the beginning, of course, you would say the Sanfords absolutely have a right to question someone coming to the door in the middle of the night. Of course, they're going to ask, what is going on here? Why are you showing up? They had never, even though they're renting the house from the Scots, they never met one another. Um, they did everything, of course, via email, right? That's what we do today. And let me check something really quick. Sorry about that. And they're renting the house from the Scots. They didn't know when they answered the door that that was the Scots. And that's why you see Clay right there, the husband, has something in his hand because they startled them. And you see here, I made sure I captured the conversation that was going on. He said, "This is our house. I'm George." You email back and forth with. So Amanda was the one who rented the house for the weekend. And from this point on, this is the most important to me, the most important part of the movie. This scene right here. They're at the door. Sorry, trying to be mindful here because I'm next to my window and there's some thundering and lightning that's going on, and I want to be mindful here. But anyways, let me stop. Let me get going. Again, this is just a conversation. This is why I feel comfortable just being natural, my natural self. So what this is here, like I said, in the book, Leave the World Behind, the name was George Washington, and the Sanfords were the same. But yet the movie changed it to Scott. And I thought that was interesting. So since I was able to pick up that the movie was about slavery, I was like, wow, they really did it. Monica, what are you talking about? They're arguing over a house. The Scots have to prove that that's their house. The Sanfords are laying claim to it for the weekend. Sanford v. Scott, or maybe you know it better as Scott v. Sanford, because it was one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions in Black American history. Some of you may not know, so let me help you out here. So, Scott v. Sanford. So, Dred Scott, he was an enslaved man and he had sued for his freedom. He argued, in this case, he was arguing that he should be free because his owner had taken him to live in free territories. So free territories meant slavery was prohibited. And so the case became known as Scott v. Sanford. Again, Dred Scott, he was an enslaved man. Um, he was arguing for his freedom because his owner had taken him to live in a free territory where slavery was prohibited, right? And the Supreme Court's decision, Chief Justice Robert B. Taney, he delivered the opinion. And what that opinion said was that African Americans were not citizens. The court ruled that people of African descent, whether they were enslaved or free, that they could not be American citizens and therefore they had no standing to sue in federal court. It also stated one of the other things it pulled out, and sorry, I do have notes in front of me. One of the other things it pulled out was that Congress couldn't prohibit slavery in territories. So the court had declared that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional. They ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery in federal territories. And then something else that came out of the Scott v. Sanford case was that enslaved people were property. It was deemed that enslaved people were property. So the court treated enslaved individuals as property, protected by the Fifth Amendment. And what did that mean? That meant that the owners couldn't be deprived of their property without due process. So that was the Dred Scott, I mean, yeah, the Scott v. Sanford decision. And think about what that did. Of course, it was a disaster for America, for the country, right? Because it intensified tensions between the North and the South. It, the ruling itself, it was eventually overturned by the 13th and 14th Amendments, after the Civil War. But this case is an example of how the Supreme Court can make grievously wrong decisions that had devastating consequences. So remember 1776, where all men were created equal, the Declaration of Independence? Well, Scott v. Sanford basically overturned that, right? The Declaration of Independence was out there declaring that all men were created equal, but yet in this case, the Scott v. Sanford case said that African Americans were not citizens, they were deemed property. So, um, that's what I was able to pull out in the movie. Again, watch the movie. There's so much more there, but I pulled that out at the end, the Scott v. Sanford. And the judge in the Scott v. Who gave the opinion in this case, Robert Taney. For those of you who still doubt that it's about slavery, well, guess what? The name Taney even appears in the movie. So let's continue. Then I went on and I discussed, and while I'm already at 27 minutes, so then I went on and I discussed part five. Part five, sorry that was cut off there. Part five of the movie was called The Last One. And the last one is important. Now, I want you to notice something there. Do you see the red, white, and blue going on in this picture here? Do you see that? So in this picture here, at this point in the movie, they're looking for the daughter Rose. She had went on there. All the family is all trying to find out what's going on. They have lost all technology. You know, they hear this loud siren. Just some strange things are happening at this point. In Rose, they're looking for her. They can't find her. They think she's off in the woods somewhere. But Rose found this home. Rose have found this home, and you can see that there's a broken window there. So she went in. Look at the red, white, and blue depiction. Isn't it? I mean, this movie is full of symbols. And so there is Rose there. She actually went into that home where she was able to find a bunker. So she found a bunker, and then we see here inside the bunker, they found food. I want you to take a minute and look at the food that's represented there. You have Aunt Jemima. You have Aunt Jemima, and the symbol of Aunt Jemima was what? That the mammy stereotype. A black woman was forced to serve white people, and it was. I don't want to get into all of that because that's not the purpose of this one. But then you also have the, remember after the George Floyd murder, they removed Aunt Jemima from packaging, and now it's called Pearl Milling Company. So Aunt Jemima was removed in 2020 after 131 years of using that image. Then you could see Uncle Ben's, again, something else that was a symbol of the subservient black man, in the Jim Crow era. But also, it was the symbol was a black man in a bow tie. He was basically in servant's attire. I'm sure you heard the term Uncle Tom, but that was also rebranded in 2020 after George Floyd. And then you have the cream of wheat. Um, you have the what else is in this video? I mean, in this picture, you have the Indian head cornmeal. You have even the Land O'Lakes. You have so much that's going on in this movie, right? I mean, in this image here that all depicts the minorities who people deemed as less than, deemed as less than. And so it's funny. It's not really funny. I'm not saying it's funny, like it's comical. But again, this depicts what the movie is about without saying it is about. You definitely have to have the discerning eye, and you have to watch it as more than just a movie. And um you know that Rose, one of the things that she wanted to do on this vacation, as they're leaving for vacation, she's watching the TV show Friends, and she's watching the reruns of it, and she's upset because there's no internet. Technology has gone out. She's not able to watch her show, and she's on the last episode. She's so upset that she's not able to watch her TV show Friends anymore. That's her whole goal. And so Rose, when she goes down into the um what do you call it? shelter, I guess, when she goes down into the shelter. Yes, they show this food, but then they show this room. It's basically a safe haven for people um to go should there be something that happened, right? It's a shelter. You have to go downstairs and get to it. But either way, in this place where she found, she was able to see they had a lot of videos, and she was able to find the TV show Friends. They had the CDs there, or DVR, I should say. There was a DVR there. She was able to watch a DVD. She found the TV show Friends, and you see there she's clicking on the last one. That is so important, the last one. So, what made me want to watch this movie? Because originally I thought it was going to be about something totally different, and I didn't want to watch the movie. I didn't want to waste time with it. But it was because and I love movies, by the way. I love to pick apart a movie. And it was because people were saying how the movie was just, it was so slow. It didn't make sense. It didn't really come to an end. The ending on the Friends episode didn't make sense, so on and so forth. That is literally what pulled me into watching the movie when I was reading about it. Because I said, all movies have a purpose. And so I wanted to figure it out, and it didn't take me long. So the last one. I also in the movie pulled out that when Clay was driving, looking for help to try to find out what was going on, he was going to drive into the city or drive around to see if he was able to see anybody else who may be able to provide an answer to what was going on. Why were they hearing loud sounds? Why did the technology go out? What was going on? And it shows 1619 on his car. Again, what was 1619? 1619. Now, who listens to AM radio these days? But anyway, 1619, I've already spoken about it. 1619 was the beginning of American slavery. And so they showed that a couple of times. So you have the numbers here. It's very important that you follow along with me. One of the things about the Friends episode, and let me go backwards here, is that one that's called The Last One. Well, if you know anything about Friends episode, they were actually, that last episode was actually in um, two parts. So it was it was season 10, but the last episode, the last one was in two parts. So it was season 10, episode 17, and then it was season 10, episode 18. So you had 17 and 18, 17 and 18, and then you had 16 and 19 as I show on the next screen. So again, I'm showing you a picture right here because this is showing you that it was 17 and 18 for the Friends episode called The Last One. What do you see here? You have 16, 17, 18, 19. 16, 17, 18, 19. Those numbers meant so much in the movie. I'm going to bring out a lot of what's going on here. Again, some of the other things I pulled out in the movie about keep 16, 17, 18, and 19 in your mind. Some of the other things that I was going over was about how even in the movie, when they showed the speedometer, they showed 65, how the speedometer was increasing because Clay was trying to get away really, really fast. And they made sure you notice what those numbers on a speedometer were. And again, those represents certain years. So in 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, abolishing slavery in the United States. If you think about 1968, the Civil Rights Act was passed. 1973, If you remember the episode where I spoke about some of the things that was going on in Black history in my Black History Month series, but in 1873, you had the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana. You had the um, in 1874, you had Freedmen's Saving Bank. And remember what was important about Freedmen's Savings Bank, if you recall, that was um, the bank where Black people deposited their money. They had trusted that institution. That was the Freedmen's Savings Bank. That was gone. They had the 1875, you had the Civil Rights Act of 1875. 1876, again, that number 76 comes up again. You had the disputed election, if I remember, it was between Hayes and Tilden, I believe it was. Sorry. But anyways, you had that. All of this is very important to African American history. I don't want to go over every single thing because, again, that's not the point. But you see where everything was increasing on the speedometer, um, and those represents years. You want to represent the years. Again, I have this scene up about the um, Sanford's versus the Scots. Remember, I went over the Scott v. Sanford. I went over the Dred Scott case and what that meant. And I went over how it's ironic because the Dred Scott case was actually fighting over residence because he lived in what was deemed a free state. He was suing for his freedom. And here they're fighting over a residence as well. The Scots, just like Scott v. Sanford, is trying to prove, hey, this is my house. I have the freedom to own this house. So then again, I'm going over the last one. And then I spoke about in the movie how, um, in the last one, how Mississippi was the last to ratify the 13th Amendment. That's what I took from the last one. But I forgot that what I was doing was exposing Leave the World Behind, and I missed something that was very obvious. That should have been very obvious. But again, me and my digging, I went over the obvious. I skipped over the obvious and went straight to something else. So let's talk about 16, 17, 18, and 19. You have 4 centuries in one story. 4 centuries in one story: 16, 17, 18, and 19. So let's talk about the 1600s there. Of course, we talked about in 1619, the White Lion arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, and American slavery begins. And then in 1641, we know that Massachusetts becomes the first colony to legalize slavery by statute. In 1662, we had a Virginia law that says children born to enslaved mothers are enslaved from birth. In 1676, we had Bacon's Rebellion, where poor whites and poor black people fought together, and the response from the ruling class um, was to create, how can I call it, racial slavery as a political party. I'll just go ahead and read it from the slides. Then we had there 1685, the Code or Nor, and I spoke about the Code Nor in one of my episodes. You got to go back to get the details. I don't want to repeat everything here, but Code Nor in French territory, again, children of enslaved mothers became property from birth, and the foundation of this was built on a system that was designed It wasn't something that was accidental. Again, if you were born into slavery, if your mother was a slave, then you were born a slave. And then the 1700s, remember 16, 17, 18, 19, 1700s, we have the expansion of slavery. The system grows. So 1705, we had the Virginia Slave Code was fully codified in slave status. So slaveholders could now punish without legal consequences. And then in 1718, you had the French that founded New Orleans. Again, we talked about Cold Noir. New Orleans became the biggest slave market in North America. 1787, we had the Three-Fifths Compromise. It was written into the Constitution. Again, enslaved people are counted as three-fifths of a person, not for their benefit, no, but it was for the benefit of political power of the slaveholding states. And then in 1793, the cotton gin is invented, and slavery was starting to become economically difficult. And then the cotton gin locked it back into place. That's what's important about the cotton gin. So evil, the evils of slavery, it was a persistent, it was finding ways to continue to sustain itself, right? That was the importance of um, the cotton gin, where slavery was becoming a financial issue. Here comes the cotton gin just to keep it sustained and to keep it growing. Then we have the 1800s, right? We have Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. You had 1857, the Dred Scott case. We already talked about him, that, it was deemed that he was declared not a person, not a citizen, and that Congress could not ban slavery. That was the law of the land in 1857. And then in 1863, January 1st was the Emancipation Proclamation. That's when it was signed. Freedom was declared on paper. 1863, Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. 1865, the Civil War ends, the 13th Amendment passes, Juneteenth happens in 1865. So from 1863 in 1865, the word that slavery had been abolished, had finally reached Texas in 1865. And I read a couple of things. Some people were saying that the people didn't know that slavery had been abolished, but I've read some places and I watched some videos where people did, in fact, know slavery had been abolished. It just hadn't been announced there yet. And so, um, but even though slavery is abolished, there was a little excerpt in there that says, except as punishment for crime. And without getting into it too much, this came up recently in a well-known case in Florida where some young guys got life in prison. And it was talking about, when I say young, I don't mean people in their 30s, 40s young. I mean 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, life in prison without the possibility of parole. And they were talking about that sweat equity. If you know, there is a Netflix series called 13th, and it talks about that very thing. It talks about that very clause, except as punishment for crime. That left the door open. Okay, let's move on. Again, 1877, Reconstruction ends and the federal troops are removed from the South. We know that Jim Crow begins. And then in 1896, we have another famous case talking about Plessy v. Ferguson. 96, even the girl, the daughter of George Scott, her name is Ruth. She has a tattoo on her arm. Guess what the number is? 96. That speaks to the Plessy v. Ferguson case, separate but equal. In other words, segregation becomes the law of the land. The war ended, but that system is what was adapted, separate but equal, meaning separate facilities for whites and blacks, but they were supposed to be deemed equal. Now we're on 1900s. 1900s, let's talk about 1919, called the Red Summer, where you had race riots in more than 30 American cities. We had 1921, Tulsa race massacre, Black Wall Street burned to the ground. Again, that was a massacre, massacre, massacre. 1954, we had Brown v. Board of Education. It overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. We had 1965, the Voting Rights Act is signed. That was the same year, by the way, that Malcolm X was assassinated. Again, we had Bloody Sunday happens in Selma. We had resistance and retaliation going on. 1968, that MLK was assassinated. We had the Poor People's March he had been planning was deliberately designed to coincide with Juneteenth. He knew, so we knew that MLK knew that that date mattered. So then in 1980, Texas becomes the first state to make Juneteenth an official holiday. 1995, Mississippi votes to finally ratify the 13th Amendment, but fails to file the paperwork until 2013. That was when Mississippi officially completed the ratification. So you had 148 years after Juneteenth that Mississippi also became the last one to officially ratify the 13th Amendment. So here we are. Here we are. June 19th, 1865. 19. I spoke to you about 16, 17, 18, and 19. In the movie Leave the World Behind, when it came up to the last one, I took that as Mississippi, but clearly it was calling out Juneteenth because you look at the series 16, 17, 18, 19. Galveston, Texas, they called it Jubilee Day. Jubilee Day. I thought that was interesting because I didn't know, in my reading, I didn't know that they had called it Jubilee Day, but that was June 19th, 1865 in Galveston, Texas. The Union troops arrived. As we know, General Orders number 3 was read in the streets. And when the freed people heard the news, I hear that, of course, there was a huge celebration they organized. And then it wasn't until like the next year in 1866, they named their celebration Jubilee Day. Um, Not Independence Day, not Emancipation Day, but Jubilee Day. And that word Jubilee um, comes from Leviticus chapter 25. That's where it talks about the Jubilee. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but I want you to let that sink in a little bit. Let that sink in. They called it Jubilee Day. Remember there, I'm jumping ahead. Okay, let me hurry up here. So again, we're coming from Leave the World Behind. Again, because in the Black History Month series, where we analyze Leave the World Behind, in part 5 of that series, where it was called, part 5 of the movie, I should say, where it was called Leave the World Behind. And that episode, that part, that section in the movie, section 5, was called The Last One. And it was connecting it to the Friends finale, as I showed, in this episodes 17 and 18, and I was tracking the numbers 16, 17, 18, and 19. And like I said, I did everything with those numbers except call out June 19th, Juneteenth, because Juneteenth has its own story. And I wanted to make sure I called that out. And what better time to do it was June 19th. And what bothers me is that I was reading some pages on Facebook about Juneteenth and what people were saying. There was some very awful stuff out there. You know, People say slavery is over, but racism is still alive and active. And I'm not coming from a victim mentality. It is literally alive and active out there. If I could even just reference the page I was reading, I was thinking I was going to read about Juneteenth. And this person is awful. It's just awful. And the comments underneath, And to say that these people aren't racist, it just, sometimes, we know that racism is out there, but sometimes when you're confronted with it or when you're reading about it, you're seeing people actually leave these comments. It's like, how can you deny that racism is still out there? So we went over from January 1st, 1863. We had the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed. So the freedom was declared on paper. In April 1865, Civil War ends. And then June 19th, 1865, that's when the Union troops arrived in Galveston. So they said that there were approximately 250,000 people that was finally able to hear the news that slavery was over. And here was General Order number 3, the full quote. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. And that was read by General Gordon Granger, Major General Gordon Granger, in the streets of Galveston, Texas, on June 19th, 1865. 250,000 people just heard that their lives changed. 250,000 people. Think about it. The proclamation had already been signed, that war was over, but there were still over 200,000 people that were still living out slavery, but slavery was technically supposed to be dead. And it was because no one had come to tell them that slavery had ended. The proclamation preceded the experience. I'm pausing here because I'm just trying to take in truly what was going on and maybe what the people were feeling. I can't even imagine what people were probably going through at that time. Um, think about this. They were legally free in 1863. So it was on paper, it was in eyes of the law. As far as the federal government was concerned, those 250,000 people, they were free. But yet, they were still working in the fields. They were still living under the same system. And it wasn't because the proclamation wasn't real, but it was because no one had come to tell them. The truth existed, but the knowledge of that truth had not yet reached them. The Bible says you shall know the truth, but the truth shall set you, and the truth shall set you free. And I read a quote where one of the people that were enslaved said they knew what was going on. So if you know the truth, what I will always say with that scripture, they say you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. That word for know there is the intimate use of know. But I always like to say, but so if you're intimately engaged in the truth, then you're applying that truth. So what I always say is the truth that you know and apply will set you free. So the truth can exist, but if you don't apply the truth to your life, you're still bound. And this is exactly what was happening here. So this is the quote that I was able to find, and they said that it was by Felix Underwood. He said, "We knowed." He said, "This is." They said what I was able to find. They said that Felix Underwood, who was a formerly enslaved man, he said, "Oh, we knowed what was going on in it all the time. We had papers in them days, just like now." The enslaved people of Texas knew. The slaveholders knew, The system continued though, because knowledge without enforcement is not yet freedom. The truth that you know and apply is what sets you free. It's saying the same thing here. Knowledge without enforcement is not yet freedom. They knew, the enslaved holders knew, but the system kept running anyway because knowing the truth and walking in the truth are literally two different things. So listen to what he said here. We knowed what was going on in it all the time. We had papers in them days, just like now. You have the Bible now. You have the truth, but are you applying the truth and truly walking in the freedom that you have been granted? Are you truly walking in the authority that you have? The war ended in April 1865, and the federal troops waded through an entire harvest season before traveling to Galveston. So the enslaved people of Texas worked one more harvest for a system that was already legally dead. Do you think the delay was accidental or was it strategic? Because someone somewhere made a decision that we're not going to automatically find a way to get this to Texas. We're going to wait. Someone made that decision. So this is where I get the scripture from. This is where Yeshua says, if you continue in my word, then you are fully disciples of mine. And if you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. You have to continue in his word, continue applying it, reading it. The knowing is part of the freedom, but knowing has to reach you. Think about it. The truth existed before those people in Galveston heard it, but the freedom did not become their lived experience until the announcement arrived. See, the truth has to reach you. It's not a small thing, but you also have to apply that truth. When you read the General Order number three, after the words that all the slaves are free, the order said this, and this was in my research. The order actually said this, that they are to remain at their present homes, work for wages, because they will not be supported in idleness. So freedom was declared, but yet in the same breath, they were told to go back to where they came from. In other words, stay on the plantation and work for wages now instead of working for nothing, but basically stay where you are. So the system didn't disappear when the announcement was made. They were told they were free, but then immediately handed a framework that kept them tied to the same land and the same labor. So freedom was there, but it also came with with a limitation. So you had freedom and limitation in the same sentence. Remain in their homes, work for wages, because idleness will not be supported. And you have to think about this. You have to think about this. What did they have to do? So here they are. They're told they're free, but they're being encouraged to stay. So when General Granger read the order, what from some of the things I read some differences, but some of the things that I read said that the announcement moved through the city. It was read at the Union Army headquarters, um, and then at the 1861 Customs House. the seat of commerce. I had not heard of the 1861 Customs House. I already put down that I was going to study that a little bit more. I just don't remember it from my history, from reading it in school. And then they said that it was at the Galveston courthouse where the law had been enforced. And then finally, they said that it ended. Now, I don't know, because I did read some places where they said this was just added in to kind of romanticize the story. But they said that it ended at Rideau Chapel AME Church. They said that the news. Um, the news of this liberation ended in worship, they were trying to say. So some things that I read said they were just trying to romanticize it because it didn't quite happen like that. They said that the government made the announcement, but it was the church that received it. You can find out so many things reading it. But but there is there was something there that I like to, I pointed out there, and I put, the news of liberation always ends in worship, and for the believer, for the disciple of Yeshua, that is actually true. Your freedom in Yeshua should absolutely end in worship. Worship of the Father who gave us a way to redeem. He redeemed us back to him. So it is a pattern there. But, I did read some things that said that they're just trying to romanticize everything. It didn't quite happen that way, but I still wanted to call it out. So 1866, Jubilee Day. So the very next year, they said the free people organized their first annual celebration, and they did not call it like Independence Day, like we hear about it. They called it, they said they marched from the courthouse to the church, and they called it Jubilee Day. And I didn't even know they called it Jubilee Day until I was doing the study for this. And I was like, wow, that came out of Leviticus 25, Jubilee. These were people who probably in many cases had never been even allowed to read. They had been given a slave Bible. And what that slave Bible was that whole sections were removed from that Bible, whole sections. So anything that deemed them free was removed from the Bible. And that's why it was called the slave Bible, because they kept things that implied that, slavery was a good thing and that they should obey their masters. So I thought it was interesting that they called it Jubilee Day. Jubilee Day, straight from Leviticus 25. So I want to ask you, what area of your life have you still been living under an order that has already been revoked? I thought about that. I thought about that as a good question to ask, because that scripture really sat with me. You should know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Well, that guy said, well, we knowed it all along. I know times are different. I'm not trying to minimize anything here. I'm just trying to bring it to today to give you some kind of prophetic application here. What area of your life, are you still living under something that has been revoked? Victory has been won. You have authority. You have freedom in Messiah. Where are you still performing labor for a master who has already lost the war? Where are you still living for the enemy? Ask yourself that. I mean, I've been, since I've been reading and studying about this Juneteenth, I wanted to have a conversation about it because, one, not just to increase my knowledge of it, but, you know, can I be just real with you all? Do you know I didn't even, Juneteenth wasn't taught to my knowledge, if I can remember. I don't remember reading about Juneteenth in school. We had that section of Black history normally taught during Black History Month, and in our history books in school, when we did speak about slavery, I don't remember reading about Juneteenth. Maybe I just don't remember it because it was the Emancipation Proclamation that was always spoken of, but I don't remember reading about Juneteenth. I don't know. Maybe I just don't remember. But while I was studying this, or while I was researching it, I said I didn't read or understand fully about Juneteenth until recent years when they made it a national holiday. I'm not from Texas, so it wasn't something that was in front of me. And when I was reading and studying about this, there was like a sense of like an anger that came within because I'm wondering, why is it that they still try to bury this? This is a part of history. It's a part of history. Yes, we should know about it. But why is it that I didn't hear about this until recently when they were talking about making it a national holiday and then it finally became one? And in that Facebook post I was reading, people said, oh, this shouldn't be a national holiday. A national holiday for what? And someone tried to explain freedom. And they said, well, that's what we have the 4th of July for. And, I am going to have a conversation on what to the slave is your 4th of July. I'm thinking about doing something on that so stay tuned. But ask yourself, but as I was studying this, I began to say, times were definitely different then. But I have a Bible full of promises, full of declarations of freedom. But where is it that I have the paper, I have the book, but I'm not living up to what that book says I can? Where am I still performing for the enemy? Remember, he has been defeated. But where am I yet living less than what I can live based on the finished work of Yeshua? Think about that. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I hope that sits differently with you now. I just hope it lands differently. And even now, as I'm having this conversation, I'm sitting here and I'm like, wow, because that brings 250,000 people who were free, but not free. And then you have one who said, we noted. Just imagine. I can't even begin to imagine. We are such an entitled group here in America. We are so entitled. And sometimes we don't even think about what could have been going on back then where they don't have the luxuries that we have today. America wasn't like it is today. But do you ever try to stop and think about what was going on back then, how they could feel, how they were feeling? Again, not a place of victimhood. Let's not do that because some people are still slaves of the mind. Some people still play the victim role. They have that victim mentality, and I am absolutely not doing that. But I do want you to sit with that verse, and then I want you to sit with approximately 250,000 people declared free and not being able to walk in that freedom. Are you living like the war is still going on? And yes, we still have a spiritual war that we fight. That's what spiritual warfare is all about. But are you living from a place of defeat? Or are you living like one who has already been declared free? They called it Jubilee Day. Jubilee Day. Read Leviticus 25 so you can know if you haven't. But I do have a section of Leviticus 25 that I did quote. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. And each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. That was the Jubilee verse. There were four things that that Jubilee was designed to restore. It was a release through the land. It was a return to property. And it was a return to family. So you had four things. You had freedom. That's the main thing, right? But that freedom meant release through the land, return to the property, and return to the freedom. To family. Just think about it. Jubilee wasn't something that was new in 1866 when they declared it Jubilee Day. It was always in the word, but that word, they didn't have it. They didn't have it. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. That's what Yeshua did for us. We are a free people. But yet, we are still fighting to be heard. We're still fighting for our place. We're still fighting to be seen. It's true and it's real. You don't have to minimize it, but you also don't have to live from that place because that's in the world. But in the spirit, we are already free. Our order was assigned. The kinsman redeemer, he paid the price. And Yeshua declared it for us. We are free indeed. Free indeed is not a contradiction of the struggle, but it is the ground that's under the struggle. Free indeed, I ask you, are you in the world where you're still fighting and struggling? Or are you living from a place in the spirit where we are already free? Thank you for this cross-to-cross conversation today on Juneteenth. I want you to read those scriptures, John 8, Luke 4, Leviticus 25. Let it sit with you. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to acknowledge truth. And don't feel you have to remain silent. No, give that silence some voice. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to Cross to Cross Conversations, where silence meets voice.